Well, we should begin. Welcome. It's so great. It's so great to see all of you. So welcome to the Democracies Project Imagining Democracy book series. Bonnie Honig she intended to join us and to introduce the panel, but unfortunately she won't be able to join us, so I am stepping in. My name is Melvin Rogers. I'm a professor of political science here at Brown. I'm the Associate Director of the PPE Center here, and I'm also one of 3 directors with Juliet and Bonnie of the Democracy Project. As many of you know, the Democracy Project promotes the study at Brown of democratic values, norms, cultures, institutions, and practices around the world, with specific focus on North American, European, and Latin American experiences with democracy. And this panel discussion of Juliet Hooker's book is the first of several that we will have this academic year as we try to sort of grapple with and think about the sort of crises of democracy and the ways in which we seem no longer to have any sense of the norms and practices that are required to sustain it, expand it, and deepen it. And so I can think of no better book with which to begin this book series, and there will be others, than Juliet Hooker's extraordinary book, Black Grief, White Grievance, The Politics of Loss. I won't try to summarize the book. Some of that will emerge in the discussion today, and I'm just here to moderate, so I won't preempt, although I got tons of questions, but I won't preempt. But let me just say the following. I mean, we really do live in unsettled and unsettling times. We do not seem to fully understand, perhaps we never did, what democracy demands of us if we mean to make good on its expansive conception of freedom and deep notion of equality. Juliet's book invites us to return once again to the question of loss that sits at the heart of democratic life. Democracy constantly holds out the promise that we're sovereign and that we exercise sovereign control. And it constantly reminds us again and again, because we rely on each other to cultivate a shared life, that we're actually not sovereign at all. And in that reminder, we often find what sits at the center of that reminder is loss. But loss in a democratic society, particularly in the United States, as we know, is unevenly distributed. And as we know, in many ways, this is not the only case, but it is the extraordinary case for the United States, that it is raced. Right? And so Juliet, at the heart of her book, she asks us, what are we to do about this? How is loss configured in our politics and our discourse? And how might democracy's insistence on the necessity of loss obscure its uneven distribution? And these are just some of the questions, I think, that sit at the heart of the book. Let me now turn to introducing our extraordinary panel. And I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Cristina Beltran is an associate professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University. A political theorist by training, her research focuses on modern and contemporary political theory, Latino and U.S. ethnic and racial politics, and feminist and queer theory. She is author of The Trouble with Unity, Latino Politics and the Creation of Identity, and Cruelty as Citizenship, How Migrant Suffering Sustains White Democracy. Thomas Zimmer is a historian and professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. His work focuses on the recent history of U.S. democracy and its discontents and the struggle over how much democracy and for whom there should be in America. He writes the Democracy Americana newsletter, hosts Is This Democracy podcast, and is a contributing opinion writer for The Guardian. Kevin Quashie teaches Black cultural and literary studies and is a professor in the Department of English. Primarily, he focuses on Black feminism, queer studies, and aesthetics, especially poetics. He is the author or editor of 4 books. Most recently, I'll only mention these: The Sovereignty of Quiet, Beyond Resistance in Black Culture and Black Aliveness, or Poetics of Being. And then, of course, Juliet Hooker is an award-winning professor of political science. She is a political theorist specializing in racial justice, Latin American political thought, Black political thought, and Afro-descendant and indigenous politics in Latin America. She is the author of Race and the Politics of Solidarity, Theorizing Race in the Americas, and editor of Black and Indigenous Resistance in the Americas. So join me in welcoming our panelists today. Cristina?
Save this microphone. You may not, I'll try to be loud. I think, can you hear me? You can hear me? Okay. Well, I want to thank the Democracy Project, and I want to thank Melvin Rogers for inviting me. And I especially want to thank Professor Juliet Hooker for another beautiful book that enriches the field of political theory and that deepens our capacity to envision a more just and democratic future. And there's chairs up in the front here, so if anybody wants to come in, feel free. Wherever you want. There is room. I'm going to quote Juliet because I think I can think of no better way to capture the book's project. Hooker writes on pages 239 to 241. I'm going to skip, but in case you have the book and you want to go to those pages. She writes, arguing that citizens need to learn to sit with loss, this book contravenes the dominant genre expectations in democratic theory, which tend to emphasize democracy's potential to empower citizens. But democracy is difficult precisely because it requires acceptance of loss. This leads us to view democratic sacrifice as a form of civic virtue, to diagnose the need for such acts as a symptom of civic health, rather than of democratic decay and domination. She goes on to say, the thinkers and activists highlighted in Black Grief, White Grievance sketch an alternative approach to Black grief that insists on feeling the depth of loss and points to how we might conceive grief is not only or is mainly grievance. It refuses the turn to redemptive suffering to make sense of loss. Instead, the African American thinkers that are at the center of this book point to a different tradition of thinking about loss that accepts contingency and vulnerability. They show us what it would mean to refuse the desire for mastery in favor of freedom dreams for all, unquote. So I think that alone is why you need to have this book immediately. And I'm very excited to both teach this book, to engage this book on a variety of locations and with a variety of communities. The book moves across history from the movement for Black Lives to the writings of Harriet Jacobs and Ida B. Wells, engaging writings on democratic sacrifice by Danielle Allen. Black Grief, White Grievance offers us an account of loss that refuses to instrumentalize Black loss and Black sacrifice, and instead analyzes the impact of loss on the political imaginations of citizens, as well as the civic practices they develop in response to it. And I think the question of cultivating better democratic political imaginaries could not literally be a more important project in the political moment we find ourselves in. So I'm most excited about the conversation, so I'm going to try to keep this brief. I want to say a few things about what I love most about this book, and then I want to turn to some questions I have. Maybe they're provocations, not for the sake of being provocative, but because I'm so excited to pose these questions with this group of thinkers. So one thing I really love about this book is the way Hooker theorizes loss on a variety of registers, from the loss of life to electoral losses and the inability to accept political loss, to her move with Aristotle to think about the citizen as a subject who is ruled and rules in turn, and to think about what it means for a population that cannot imagine itself being ruled, right, cannot imagine the process of democratic sharing, to the loss of a particular vision of democracy. So thinking about even the fact that certain citizens in this country were shocked in the Trump era of what that moment and the ongoingness of that has told them about what kind of democracy or non-democracy we live in. So just thinking about the way those sort of multiple registers operate and, as she puts it, become political through the process of people mobilizing around them, all the while noting these different sites of loss, while also continuing to center the fact in the US, as she puts it, where democracy has never distributed loss equitably. I also appreciate the critique of the literature on mourning within the field of democratic theory. So the work of political theorists like David McIver and Simon Stowe. I would put Heather Poole in in this grouping as well. While finding value in their work, Hooker's critique of the way that this body of scholarship sometimes treats Black grief as a kind of, as she puts it, a source of democratic energy and renewal that even while good intentioned can be somewhat unintentionally parasitic on Black death and grief. I think this is a powerful point about how even good intentioned and politically impassioned democratic theory can still, in some sense, unintentionally instrumentalize Black suffering and loss by taking a sort of romantic narrative that fails to sit with the injustice of its reparative turn. And I think it's that fundamental insight of the text regarding the unequal distribution of loss, who is made to carry the unfair share of democracy's deficits and failings. I also think another thing that is just incredibly powerful here is the turn to aesthetics and affect, both of which seem absolutely critical for making sense of our politics, our attachment to our sense of memory, our attachments, our history, the present, and the future. Using that lens to read the work of Harriet Jacobs and Ida B. Wells, how their own writings pursue different aesthetic strategies in order to mobilize affect among white and non-white readers. So there's so much in this text, as I said, that is so exciting. I also want to talk about some things that I sort of want to raise as just questions or things that excite me, but also I'm still wrestling with. I don't ask these in the spirit of having an answer. I ask it in the spirit of like, what do you think? What are we going to do about this? One thing I was interested in is it's a great title, right? Black Grief, White Grievance. I wonder if the title sometimes, though, creates a binary that also boxes us back into certain dynamics. And so I want to talk a little about what I mean by that. So part of this is a question that this book is by a leading hemispheric scholar. I'm one of the editors of Theory and Event. We're publishing a gorgeous work of Juliet's on José Martí and how Martí interrogates debates about Confederate monuments. And yet, at times in the book, I wanted to say, and I'm sure you've been getting this from some people, like, what about, does this end up kind of re-establishing a certain kind of black-white binary? Does it invisibilize Latinx and Asian American populations? It does some really powerful, not a lot, but deeply powerful work around indigeneity. But I'm thinking about this question, not so much in the sense of no book can do everything. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that and also to want to center in a critical way the centrality of anti-blackness is a critical political endeavor. It's a critical endeavor in democratic and political theory. So the question is not the worth and necessity of that endeavor. For me, the question was thinking about, would your theory of grievance do something different if you were working on the multiple registers that white grievance operates in the United States? And thinking about how those different racialized communities encounter white grievance. Would that impact, do you think, the book's argument or analysis? Would it just serve to give more examples of the problem? Or would it actually maybe transform some of the arguments or open up some of those arguments? For example, something that I talk about in Cruelty of Citizenship is the way that forms of white grievance around anti-migrant politics often focus on grievance around the politics of movement, right? Who gets to move? Who gets to move with impunity across land? And whose movement must be constrained? That question and the sense of the attachment to freedom in movement that operates among a certain kind of conception of frontier freedom, and how that happens when migrants are now the people moving with impunity, right? Like that kind of makes a story of grievance take a certain kind of turn around theorizing movement. I'm thinking of Hagar Kotev's work here as well. So I guess the question for me is like, what different registers might that invite? But also the choice, I'd just love to hear more about that because I think it's both critical and also it left me kind of hungry. The other question I have is the ways in which white grievance and white citizens, I'm wondering if they're rendered somewhat monolithic at times. And this is a book clearly talking about racially resentful white subjects. Trump-type people on the right, certainly that's a place we know white grievance is manifesting itself in a million ways. But we also hear in the book, and I think importantly, about forms of white grievance that operate at a liberal or progressive register, right? When liberals and progressives also fall prey to white grievance. And we know this happens. But it seems to me that white grievance functions differently depending on the politics of various white citizens. And I think this is related to a distinction that's both made but not necessarily always hit hard, which is the distinction between white citizens and whiteness as an ideology, as a political color, right? And I think this distinction might be important. And one of the ways I would argue it's important is I think one of the reasons the right now, the right wing is so freaked out, is precisely because whiteness is not doing the same kind of work it used to do. It's precisely, and one of the other things I love about this book is the drawing on Joel Olson. I think the late Joel Olson was just a critical voice at the time, kind of alone or very much in the wilderness with a handful of other voices, Laurie Balfour and others, but writing about these questions of white supremacy and political theory. And Joel Olson wrote a short article about this very question of talking about partisanship and the kind of divides between white citizens and the sort of breakdown of the consensus around white democracy. That it's precisely that breakdown among white citizens of that consensus around white democracy that is also producing a sense of the world exploding and families fighting over, Thanksgivings. But this idea then that there is less consensus among white people about the status of white grievance than at any other time in our country, which is either a hopeful thought or a depressing one, maybe both. But this country feels divided in part precisely because it's not simply people of color, but it's white people who are increasingly divided around these issues of race and gender and sexuality. And the other side of this story is also the question of the way whiteness is an ideological practice that can move across racial groups, right? And so that people who are non-white can also become invested in the politics of domination and whiteness and grievance. So thinking about that question, at times we're reading about Ida B. Wells, white citizens, but I'm thinking about is the story, because we move historically in this text across a large scale of time, and I was wondering if white grievance, how it changes, and how does it change, or is it the same? Is it sort of, we can always identify it, or is white grievance evolving? And what of the white grievance of white liberals or progressives? Is it just the same when the chips are down, or is there something different about that? And I guess my last point around that, because I don't want to talk for too long. Similarly, I was thinking about black communities in the language of black grief and thinking about, on the one hand, black grief being a pervasive event, affective experience for black people. On the other hand, does it operate at different registers depending on where people are located in that story? We know that class doesn't protect people. We know that, that death can come upon people through state violence in all kinds of ways that don't register on those levels of class, for example. I was just teaching Black Marxism when we were talking about the ontological totality that that Robinson speaks of, and I sense that story of ontological totality in this text. But I also think about how does grief operate for the middle class, for more affluent folks, for folks with different kinds of experiences in their work and home lives. Does that grief move in different ways? So it's sort of the mirror question to the grievance question. And I guess the last thing I'm interested in is, this is a text that on the one hand is asking us all to sit with black loss and loss in general, while also criticizing what many white citizens are mourning and arguing that they should not be mourning the loss of white racial standing, right? That there's something deeply problematic about mourning their desire to dominate, and that such forms of white grievance are profoundly anti-democratic. And Hooker writes, if the United States is ever to become a genuine multiracial democracy, it cannot continue to demand sacrifices of some while allowing others to mourn justified losses they refuse to accept. So there's an argument here calling on white citizens to learn to accept the legitimate losses they're failing. While at the same time, there's an argument here that white citizens need to grieve in a particular way, and that some forms of grief, to my understanding, that some forms of grief to some extent are unethical. So I want to know if I'm right about that. Are some forms of grief unethical? And I'm persuaded that certain types of grievance are indeed a democratic dilemma. But I also think because this work operates on the level of aesthetics and affect, which also both involve a kind of visceral response, a kind of visceral response that we can't fully control. One thing that affect and aesthetic theory teach us is that our desires are non-sovereign. We cannot always control what we want. We can control what we do about what we want, but we can't control. We have a certain, I can, if I think something is beautiful, I can be convinced that it's beautiful. I can be persuaded that something is beautiful, but if I may not feel it, or a song, or a poem, right? I may not be convinced in that way. So I guess I wanted to think about this question of the non-sovereign quality of grief, and wondering if part of the persuadable work we need to do is also make space for people to grieve unjust attachments. And is that part of the story, is that we have to, what is the democratic space for people to grieve things they should not, by any ethical standard, want to grieve? So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Should I go next? Okay. All right, let's see. Does that work for everyone? Yeah, okay. So I have to apologize for the way my voice sounds. We had a birthday yesterday for my older son, my 6-year-old, and I was in charge of the treasure hunt. And that included, it was a bunch of 5 or 6-year-olds, and that included a lot of yelling. And apparently that was too much for my voice. So I'm sorry. More importantly, I was really honored by the invitation. I'm very grateful to be here and be part of this discussion on what I believe is an important book, a book that makes an important intervention in our current democracy discourse. I will say that Black Grief, White Grievance was a challenging read for me. I do not mean that in a negative sense. I'm not trying to say, oh my God, I was struggling to get through this thing. I mean it on the contrary, I mean it as in this book challenged me. It challenged me to, it challenged my understanding of American politics and society by offering what I thought was an incredibly useful framework of how to think about or rethink sort of America's past and present. I read the book as a plea not to idealize the kind of democracy that the US has been, a plea to political theorists, to democratic theorists, but also to historians. I am a historian, so that's how I read the book. I also read it as a powerful dissection of what the experience of democracy has been for, what it's been like for subordinated groups, and how that's in stark contrast to how dominant groups experience and imagine democracy. And I very much agree with you, Cristina, that it's the imagining democracies of what is our collective imaginary of democracy and the kind of democracy this is supposed to be. That is really, I think, what got me going while reading the book. Again, I'm a historian, and also someone who often talks publicly about the current political conflict and how to situate it in this broader, longer-term context of democracy's contested history in this country. And that is was my perspective on the book. So my goal is to highlight a few of the ways in which I think the book challenges certain pervasive notions about American history and the current conflict over democracy that I think desperately need to be challenged. So obviously the book is a stark repudiation of white grievance politics. At its core, that's what Trumpism is, right? I mean, as a political project, what is Trumpism if not the promise to mobilize the coercive power of the state for the purpose of imposing a sort of a white nationalist order on the country and punish those who dare to deviate, to guarantee that white grievance will continue to define the polity. And I think Juliet Hooker rightfully emphasizes that white grievance is actively mobilized as a political strategy, as part of a reactionary political project. That, however, is not what the pervasive backlash narrative wants us to believe. The backlash narrative tends to put the agency solely with traditionally marginalized, subordinated groups who are ultimately, in this backlash narrative, at fault for causing an inevitable reaction, like a predictable sort of near automatic response. Right? This is what makes the backlash narrative so attractive to people who seek to delegitimize the supposed quote-unquote excesses of social justice activism and any kind of politics that aims to level traditional hierarchies. In such a tale, reactionaries have no agency and thus cannot be blamed. Right? They're only, and somewhat justifiably, reacting to marginalized groups going quote-unquote too far. That is sort of what comes with this backlash metaphor. Racial politics has often been driven by a logic of defeatist appeasement and sort of preemptive abandonment of justice and equality and progress in the name of unity and in the name of preventing backlash. These dynamics of white backlash politics have often stifled, or rather been used to deliberately stifle, egalitarian policies. But the key, I think, is to acknowledge that reactionaries are actively mobilizing. They are deliberately participating in a political project of preventing America from ever becoming an egalitarian, multiracial, pluralistic democracy. They have agency, right? I mean, taking these people seriously should mean, well, acknowledging that they have agency, and that means they can and should be held accountable for the political choices they make and for the policies and politicians they support. Now, in the mainstream political discourse, the goal, of course, often is to not hold them accountable and instead preserve white innocence. And that is a term that is sort of plays a prominent role in the book. The book offers a searing critique, and very, I think, rightfully so, of these narratives of white innocence as they, and this is a quote, exempt the white majority from complicity in and responsibility for unleashing state power on vulnerable racial others, end of quote. Now, the dogma of white innocence holds that whatever the political choices and actions of white Americans, we must presume benign motives and reach for non-incriminating explanations. There is a powerful incentive to sanitize the political choices of white conservative Christians specifically. They are just, quote, regular folks, right? And as such, they cannot be wrong. Usually, this is achieved by, apologist tales about why they either didn't mean to or they had to support extremism, economic anxiety, anti-elite backlash, or just a reaction to liberals being mean or left-wing identity politics going crazy. Someone or something made them do it, right? Vote for Trump or whatever. Now, you'll see this if you look at the reactions, and I'm talking about the mainstream political discourse. I'm talking about what's in the New York Times and the Washington Post, right? Whenever people wrote waves of racial resentment to political prominence, their success has been described in such terms, right? Whether it was George Wallace's surprisingly successful presidential run in 1968 or David Duke's near victory in the 1990 Senate election in Louisiana. Look at what's in the mainstream papers the next day. It's all about, well, these people clearly, first, there has to be a reason why they had no other choice but to support these people. Now, crucially, apologist ideas of white backlash and tales of white innocence are not just prevalent on the right, but they are central to the mainstream political discourse. And that is where I see one of the key contributions of this book. It dissects and it dismantles historical myths as well as current distortions that shape and define the mainstream democracy discourse, that define democracy in the liberal imaginary specifically. And I think that's really important, right? This is not just about whatever is going on so in the right-wing intellectual sphere or amongst like Trump voters or whatever. It's very much about the sort of what is democracy, what has democracy been in the liberal imaginary. Recent events, the rise of Trump first and foremost, have shaken certain widely held exceptionalist ideas about America's supposedly glorious democratic past and stable democratic present. Of course, for subordinated groups, Juliet Hooker reminds us in the book, this is a quote, "The United States has never been a full democracy in which they can expect to exercise equal citizenship or have their rights respected. U.S. democracy has always been broken for some." This is evidently true as it is a stark rejection of ideas of a glorious democratic tradition that have long featured prominently in the national imaginary and have been widely held and cherished among elites almost from across the political spectrum. Any historically informed understanding of U.S. history should start by acknowledging what democracy has meant as the historical norm in America, and undoubtedly before the civil rights legislation of the 60s, a system that was, by contemporaneous comparison, fairly democratic if you happened to be a white Christian man, and something else entirely if you were not. Reconstruction period was a notable exception from this norm, but America's first attempt at biracial democracy immediately after the Civil War was quickly drowned in ostensibly race-neutral laws and white reactionary violence. After Reconstruction, the country was dominated for decades by a white elite consensus to not only leave the apartheid regime in the South untouched, but to uphold white Christian patriarchal rule within the confines of a narrowly restricted version of democracy. I think it's important to think about democracy not as yes or no, black or white, but on a scale, right? It is a kind of, you can call it white democracy, white man's democracy, a racial caste democracy, Herrenvolk democracy. The label does not matter. It's important how we think about this, right? In terms of like, if you want to understand American history, it's no use either to say everything since 1776 is democracy, end of story, or Well, not a democracy, end of story. Think of it in terms of a scale, and it is a kind of narrowly defined, narrowly restricted white democracy. Now, I believe ideas of America's inherent democratic goodness since 1776 have been, thankfully, on the retreat. However, in the established liberal imaginary, 1965 has come to mark this moment of glorious democratic rebirth. It has basically replaced 1776. A story has emerged that combines a relatively unsparing critique of American history pre-1965 with a nostalgic insistence that the country left that history behind with the rights revolution of the 60s, brought about by the moral force of a peaceful movement that finally helped America see the light. In this tale, while not everything became perfect overnight, the country was certainly and inevitably set on a path towards post-racial democracy. Now, Juliet Hooker has very little sympathy for what she rightfully calls the, quote, romantic narrative of the civil rights movement. Not just because it's not a historically accurate diagnosis, and it's not, but also because it's had lasting, distorting effects as this, again, quote, template for acceptable black protest based on a romanticized account of the civil rights movement of the 1960s continues to constrain black activism by reducing it to political martyrdom. This strikes me as such a profoundly important point, and I really don't think it can be overstated how much this romanticized, nostalgic perspective on the civil rights era shapes the liberal imagination still today. Just think about how, at least until the Dobbs decision last year, the Supreme Court was widely seen among liberals as an ally in the fight for a more democratic, fairer society, a view stemming entirely from a romanticized understanding of the court's history, misconstruing the Warren Court era of the 50s and 60s as the norm, when really that era was a massive outlier compared to the role this institution has played for most of its existence. And that nostalgic view of the civil rights movement and the civil rights moment of the 60s more broadly is now being mobilized against social justice activism today. Ironically, or rather perversely, I guess, the civil rights movement is now often held up as a model serving to delegitimize today's racial and social justice protests and claims by the same groups, those who Martin Luther King called the white moderates, and with the exact same arguments, too extreme, too divisive, too radical, too much, too fast, that were advanced against the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Now, my final point. This romantic understanding of the civil rights movement and this romantic distortion of democracy's recent past in general, it also continues to shape the reaction to Trumpism. As this view, and much of the crisis of liberal democracy discourse in general, is predicated on the idea that America was a healthy, stable liberal democracy until Trump came along, Trumpism is seen as an aberration. It is, quote-unquote, not who we are. The goal, therefore, is a restoration, but decidedly not transformation, of the pre-Trump, pre-2016 state of liberalism. Just restore the established norms and institutions of the system. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying that's sort of where the imagination ends, right? In fact, in this perspective, those who demand a transformation because they reject the status quo ante as actually not all that democratic are viewed as too radical, too extreme, too divisive, too woke, whatever it may be. This, to me, is the defining conflict within the, nominally at least, pro-democracy camp, the defining question regarding America's near-term future, if we assume that Trumpism doesn't just win outright. Is resistance liberalism actually just engaged in a restorative effort that is comfortable for everyone from never-Trump conservatives to centrist liberals precisely because it is just it just wants to return the clock. It just wants to turn the clock back by a few years. Is it really just a coalition of restoration, or is the resistance to Trumpism under the banner of democracy in crisis tied to a transformative vision that could actually move us beyond the status quo ante, so that we are not back in a situation that gave rise to Trumpism or resulted in Trump in the first place, but closer to America becoming the land it has never been yet, an egalitarian, multiracial, pluralistic democracy, a society in which the individual's status and experience is not significantly determined by race, wealth, gender, religion, or sexual orientation. Juliet Hooker's book is a powerful reminder, or it was for me certainly, that if we pay attention to black loss, like grievance. If we decenter the white democratic experience, the answer should not be just to restore, but it has to be to transform. She captures this defining conflict precisely in the distinction she makes between merely repairing white democracy, that's the project of restoration, versus salvaging it. And I quote, "The aim of salvaging is not to repair the ship, but to dismantle white democracy, to strive for a future in which the communities built from the wreckage can thrive." And I think that's precisely the challenge, isn't it? Thank you very much.
I'm really grateful to see so many people I know here, graduate students from past classes, incredible faculty colleagues. Yeah. Across the arc of Juliet Hooker's thinking, especially across race and the politics of solidarity or theorizing race in the Americas, I've recognized three investments. One, what do we do with race as a category that remains intractable and intractably meaningful? Two, what do we do with hope as a necessity in democracy? And three, the intersection of these two, what do we do with race as an intractable and intractably meaningful locus of hope's own intractable manifestation in American democratic thought? It is with my own modest assessment of Professor Hooker's intellectual investments that I approach the elegant Black grief, white grievance, the politics of loss. This is a book of conundrums, perhaps beginning in the two titular nouns, grief and grievance. The binary in the title might seem to suggest that grief belongs to Blackness, grievance to whiteness, but one conundrum is that even the full capacious wildness of grief never fully belongs to Black social subjectivity, because the terms of Black loss and Black harm and Black grieving get turned into appeals to or indictments of the state. So there is no Black grief, not as a term of the political. There is the discourse of Black grief, its failure, its ineptness, but there is no Black grief. In an anti-Black world frame, death and Blackness are so over-indexed that Black grief becomes conceptually impossible. A related conundrum, then, is that there's also no possibility for Black grievance, because even appeals to or indictments of the state also fail. They're structured to be performative in their failure. So, no Black grief, no Black grievance. Another conundrum, that loss itself is hard to count and to account for, which makes the politics of loss nearly impossible, since the political necessarily requires something of a collective, accountable legibility. Loss is too poetic, too affective, too intimate. Even contemporary political thinkers who aim to account for these terms of feminization, and here I mean the poetic, the affective, and the intimate. I'm using feminization in the way that Bonnie Honig might term it. Even those theorists come up a bit short. And still another compounding conundrum, and here is a quotation from Professor Hooker. Black loss is both legitimate and illegible. Black loss is both legitimate and illegible. This book might be called The Compendium of Conundrum, American Racialized Democratic Thought. Or it might be called Meditations on Loss and on Losing Loss. I'm being playful in renaming the work because I love so much its ideation of loss as a public thing, again to borrow Bonnie Honig's language. The way that Professor Hooker extend Danielle Allen's writing, especially about democracy's vernacular of loss, into the complicated brilliance with which she closes the book. Quote, democratic theory needs to be able to say what is democratic about loss, not just offer visions of democratic citizenship as the unimpeded exercise of freedom, agency, and sovereignty, end quote. I admire so much about this book, especially its theorization of loss as a public thing. So, inspired by that, here's some things I'd love to hear more about. One, Is it possible to theorize a political concept of Black loss, grief, and grievance without or beyond the contusion of whiteness and Blackness? Near the end of the book, Professor Hooker, in a full lyric voice, writes this next thing ambivalently. Quote, "For Black people, sitting with loss would mean setting aside expectations to immediately move from grief to grievance. At the same time, it is important to recognize that one of the potential pitfalls of not moving from grief to grievance is that it can have apolitical or anti-political implications," end quote. Even with that quick, anxious acknowledgement of the risk of apolitical or the anti-political, I want to linger for a minute with another iteration of my first question, one that is hard to say out loud, or hard to say accurately, or hard to say out loud accurately, which is this: are there ways to account for ordinary Black loss that, in its ordinariness, might better behold grief? And is this possibility useful to political thinking, given that the political always has to reckon with collectivity, and given that the collective of Blackness is never, ever ordinary? There's a moment in Spike Lee's Jungle Fever that I would love to narrate here that I think exemplifies that, but I'm going to not narrate it here for the sake of time. 2, is there a way to think Black loss beyond the examples that synonymizes loss and death, especially because of the constitutive functioning of death in the structure of anti-Blackness? That is, given the plethora of examples of Black death as a part of Black collective or democratic or world experience, what else can we gain from finding other ways to think of Black loss beyond the totality of death as a reality? 3, maybe embedded in the last 2 queries is the distinction between the unspeakable as a political condition and the unsayable as a philosophical or psychic or linguistic or theological one. The unspeakable and the unsayable surely overlap, but I wonder if there isn't something in the imperative to try to say loss that might be salvaged by not trying to say loss at all, to give up on trying to say anything about loss. Does reckoning with loss as a term of democracy require something else other than saying? I'm going to skip this next one because I'm worried about time. It's about Toni Morrison and truth. You can ask me later, or not. No, I trust my movement. Thank you, though. Thank you for the space. What should have been 5 but is now 4. Professor Hooker is brilliant in delineating the terms of white grievance as immaculate complaint and mobilized enactment. White grievance, she tells us, is phantasmical and futuristic. It imagines the anticipation of loss and then acts so as to forestall or correct loss that hasn't really happened, hasn't yet happened. In a way, sometimes I think, as she writes, that this iteration of white loss and of white grievance might be part of another racialized affective binary, Black anger and white guilt. So, as this iconic form of white loss is exceptionally and dangerously political, it is also excessively politicized. I'm grateful for that articulation, and I wonder then, are there other forms of white loss that might need to be made politicized too? And maybe in part, this is adjacent to part of Professor Beltran's comment, and maybe even some of your thinking about multiracial whiteness. Do we need other terms of white loss? Not only the loss that is about real or imagined threats to dominance, and certainly not only the always fraught claim that racism demeans white humanity. I'm not suggesting that that claim is not true. Scholars as thinkers as deep as Morrison and Baldwin and Douglas all note the ways in which racism demeans white humanity, but I'm conscientious of the fact that in a culture that would to displace the injury that racism does to non-white people, I'm too cautious to to be invested in what racism might do to white people. So we need another term of white loss, maybe. We need another way, if white people are indeed going to be here on earth with people who are not white, and in ways that don't only cauterize harm, there has to be maybe another way also of thinking and talking about white loss. I don't know what that is, but I came to that question partly by the exquisite thoroughness of Professor Hooker's exposure of the limits of loss as such operates in our world frames now. 5, not 6. I read in Professor Hooker's book a ghostly presence of a kind of American pragmatism, or maybe a revision of American pragmatism. Maybe I'm wrong because I've been thinking again of Richard Rorty, but I wonder, is there pragmatist democratic praxis lurking in your work? Let me end. It might be hard to believe the facts of terribleness being what they are in the world. It might be hard to believe that there is also decency, and indeed that these could be decent days, or at least decent days live next to terrible days, or maybe even that good days are here and can be here again. It might be hard to believe because the world is such a terrible place. But I believe it partly because of the invocation that is offered in Professor Hooker's new book. There are better days, and if they're not here, we can imagine them. And we are made better if only because of this insistent clarity. Quote, democratic theory needs to be able to say what is democratic about loss, not just offer visions of democratic citizenship as the unimpeded exercise of freedom, agency, and sovereignty, end quote. Yes. And here is Juliet Hooker offering us loss as a potential metonym for such democratic philosophical expansiveness, to be able to include modesty and vulnerability and humility and ferocity and disappointment and neediness and gratitude. Gratitude, which is what I have for Professor Hooker's work, and especially for this new book.
Yes. So, first of all, thank you to all of you. Can you hear me? Thank you to all of you for being here and being part of this conversation. Thank you for Melvin for having the idea for this panel and organizing things, to Allie for putting it together. And thank you to my wonderful folks who came to talk to me about the book and who found such, who read it with such care and had such challenging things to ask me to say more about. So I'm going to try to say something about some of the questions that they posed. So the first thing that I guess I'm going to respond in order and to say, so obviously I was also troubled about the black-white binary, even as I was doing it, and my short answer to that, right, is to say that the book is making an argument that black grief and white grievance have been driving forces in contemporary racial politics in the U.S., which is not to exclude other things, but say if we look at Trumpism through January 6th, if we look at the movement for Black Lives and those protests. But I think you are right to say that it does raise the question of, how do we think about the Latinx folks who participated in January 6th or who have adhered to that project, or that there might be, something very different to say when we think about, I think there's certainly no to think about, Asian Americans in the moment of the pandemic and the sort of the ways in which folks were othered. I mean, there's a history of that, right, in the United States, but that thinking about, the work that was doing, I think, so I think that I would be interested in thinking about what that looks like, but I did have to set that aside because I didn't have, that would have been a whole other book, and I didn't.
Right.
So that's the very unsatisfying answer to that, and I do try at various points where it seems to make sense to at least gesture in that direction, but I think there is a lot more thinking to be done, some of which I know you're doing on how we think about this. But I guess one thing that I would say is I think, somebody who is Latin American, became Latinx, I do think that we do have to grapple with this question of how people become, people who are subordinated, people who are, who are non-white in terms of the category of whiteness as a kind of political identity, how they become invested in that project, right? Like, how does that work? Effectively, but in other ways. And is it the desire to participate in domination, right? So that is that what is it? I mean, I think this applies to, if you think about white women as well, right, who are part of that project, but who are also, of course, suffering from its patriarchal investments. I guess one of the things, in terms of the sort of question about, white grievance and the how to think about it beyond the racially resentful white subjects who I think, definitely are are some of the obvious candidates for whom people that we think of as deploying white grievance. But I think in this case, there's something really interesting happening actually between that question that you pose and Thomas's remarks, right? That the way in which this works often, I would say for white, white progressives or, liberals or whoever, is that on the one hand, some of that sense of displacement, right? Some of is still at work even if folks have those commitments, right? So if you think about all the folks who have gotten on the sort of like, the sort of we're suffering from censorship bandwagon and cancel culture. I mean, that spans the ideological spectrum, and it's partly about the sort of democratization of who can contest certain narratives and who can speak back in these forums that aren't, right? You don't have to get invited to go give a big talk at the academy, or you go and some student group pickets you or boos you or does whatever, right? That these are about challenges to these kind of accepted hierarchies that aren't just confined, to folks on the, to conservatives, for example. So I think that's one way that we can think about begin to think about how that works, or how it might work. So, in terms of whether some forms of grief are unethical, I mean, one of the things that I try to say in the book is that I'm not trying to prescribe how people should grieve, because I think that's simply, you can't do that. What I do try to say is that I think we can make decisions about what losses we need to attend to as a democracy, which is different from what people might grieve in private or what people might feel. You know? And so I think that's what I would say, which is to say, you know, folks can mourn their displacement from the center of, you know, this, you know, folks who are, for example, feel displaced by something like the 1619 Project because of the kind of story that it's telling isn't one about, you know, the U.S. exceptionalism. But I don't think that we need to organize our, you know, our politics or, you know, around appeasing those feelings of displacement is what I would say, right? And I think that's part of the problem that I'm trying to call attention to, right? That when we make that move, what we're saying is some people's losses, whether real or imagined, matter more than others. And that's part of the critique. I'm going to turn to Thomas now, and I guess you know, one of the things that that I appreciate about your comments is that I think it did, it helped me answer Christina's question, but also I think the sort of clarity about some of the ways in which these, you know, the ways in which these accounts of U.S. democracy, you know, that are, you know, that are dominant still, are really continuing to shape how people think about what the threat is to U.S. democracy and how we should respond to it. And I really, I think you're right that the narrative of Trumpism as an aberration leads to this kind of restorative move, right? So if we just, you know, if we just get people to start abiding by the rules, we'll be fine, as opposed to actually the rules were kind of broken before, and maybe we need to do something more than that. And I think that there really is you know, there is a very much a large section of people for whom that is the extent to how they see the problems or the challenges that U.S. democracy is facing. And so, on the one hand, that is, I think, that is disheartening, but it also is an opportunity, right? Because I think you're right that the book is trying to say, you know, these kind of dominant stories that we've told ourselves about democracy are based on the experiences of those who have not had to experience democracy as a series of losses, right? And so I think thinking about and keeping that in mind is really important for how we diagnose, right, the current crisis of democracy, which is always, U.S. democracy has always been in crisis, right, from certain perspectives, and also, you know, how we think about, like, even if we think about the language of backsliding, right, that assumes that there's a healthy norm. So I think that, you know, this, you know, I think I hadn't quite, you know, thought about it in this way, but I think you're right that 1965 had, you know, this moment of the civil rights movement, that it's doing a really important work in the liberal imagination beyond the ways in which it functions to discipline Black protesters. Turning now to Professor Quashie, who, you know, when they asked me who I wanted to be in dialogue with, I was like, well, we have to get Kevin because he always makes you sound so much smarter. You know, he gives the best account of your book, and I, you know, and he has lived up to his reputation. Thank you for that. So I think that, that you are right, that part of, I think one of the challenges for me, I'm thinking about your question about there is no Black grief, no Black grievance, and which I think is related to this question of how do we think about ordinary Black loss, and how do we think about Black loss as more than death? I mean, I think one of the things that, one of the tensions for me in the book is that, of course, we tend to focus on the sort of spectacular moments, right? The moments of real, visible state violence, right? Which tend to mobilize people. And one of the things that I lynching, right? Police killings. But one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize in the book is that there are also all these other sets of losses that are quotidian every day, right? So, there was just an article in the Washington Post, I believe, recently about weathering and how, stress ages the body, and thinking about, right, having to deal with racism is obviously a huge source of stress. And so but that's not something that, right, we don't have protest against weathering, right? There are all these ways in which, there are these losses that I think it's just really hard to see and to make visible. And then again, there's the tension. Making them visible is itself a cost, right? So I think that for me, there was this this line that I was trying to part of what this project is about saying, for us, and political theorists, democratic theorists, that there's often a move, right, to, I think, to glorify certain forms of political activism without paying attention to what is entailed in that labor. And I think about your own work as sort of calling attention to how, thinking about people in their full humanity means that we need to see them as more than activists and more than just political subjects in this kind of narrow way. And so part of this for me in this book is trying to, against my training, right, to try to open space for that in the traditions in which I work. And then the other, thing about whether we can, about this question of what whether we can actually reckon with loss, and whether, what does that mean when we consider the sort of unspeakable, unrepresentable dimensions of loss. I mean, one of the things that, I think was important for me as I was writing the book was to be attentive to the limits of what I could do, right? Because there is, precisely to recognize that that the whole project in itself is trying to do something that that has limits, right? That as much as, and that part of what I could do was to bring my attention to the ways in which we come up against those limits. There's one of the things that I talk about in the book is this idea of the sonic, because Frederick Douglass talks about how even after he had escaped from slavery, hearing the sorrow songs had this effect on him. And he talks about himself, and Douglas is not usually someone who's, at all humble. So he says, they were more capable of making you understand slavery more than my writings ever could, which is certainly not his usual take. And so to me, that spoke to this way in which this is not something that, political theorists tend to acknowledge, that there are limits to what we can say and how, what we, that there are dimensions of this that could not be captured.
The interludes.
Yeah. And so part of it was trying to wrestle with that, and then with the other issue of I want to hear, by the way, what the Morrison question was, because Morrison is an important, comes in at a very important moment in chapter 3, where I'm writing about Harriet Jacobs and Ida B. Wells, in order to, and I quote her on this question of how do you basically ethically tell these stories of loss, right? How do you do it in a way that you're not offering up people's pain in exchange for possible sympathy, and how do you, and we're seeing that right now, right, when we see like how many photographs of children suffering do we need to care about what is happening to them, right? And so part of it is about, part of the project was really about trying to wrestle with those things, to put them on the table clearly. But I think there are dilemmas, as you say, there are conundrums that we're all still dealing with. I think I'm going to leave it at that.
So let me just say, we're going to have another session of questions here, but you got to join me again now in applauding for this exceptional conversation and exchange. So we're in a cozy space, so we don't need any mics. Raise your hand, and we'll sort of proceed, and we'll proceed in that way. We're here until 5:30, so we have 20 minutes. That's a good bit of time to ask some questions of Juliet and the panelists.
Professor Hooker and everybody, thank you so much. In your Solidarity book, one of the claims that I thought was really important and challenging was that for there to be any possibility of multiracial solidarity, whites would have to learn that they see whitely. And I just wonder if you could connect that to the themes you're talking about in this book with the constellation of issues around Black loss, and what resources there might be, whether discursive, aesthetic, affective, Islamic, that would provoke the possibility of whites learning that they see whitely, and maybe making some space for solidarity.
Yeah. So that's a good question. I think I think one of the things that I do in this book is to say that we need to interrogate the assumption that we often have that if we just expose suffering, people will be moved to act, right? That they will recognize, especially that there's been an injustice or a harm, and that they need to therefore do something about it. Part of, I guess in this book I'm a bit more skeptical about about whether that's actually what's happening in those moments when people are being confronted with these images or whatever it is of losses of people they consider to be in some way other than themselves. But I think I'm also, maybe part of what I'm doing is also saying, even if that does happen, that is still a loss. That is still requires a kind of activism and a kind of exposure that we need to reckon with, right? And so, you know, I think that's, you know, one moment that that I write about in the book is after the Derek Chauvin trial, when he's you know, sentenced, and you know, there are these responses, one from Nancy Pelosi thanking him for his sacrifice. You know, and it's so crazy because of course he wasn't an activist. He wasn't trying to make US democracy better. He wasn't trying to make some kind of progress towards racial justice. He was a human being who was killed while he was, you know, just living his life, and yet we have to put it into this frame. So part of, you know, part of what I think I'm trying to say is, even as they were even as she thought she was honoring him, right? Even though she thought she was seeing him, she wasn't really seeing the full picture. So I guess part of what I'm suggesting is maybe that we need to interrogate some of these frames through which we have conditioned ourselves, been conditioned to understand Black activism, to understand, right, how progress towards racial justice or social transformation in general happen. Because then there are important things that we miss, you know, when all we see are sort of heroic activists, you know, who bring about social change.
So there was a hand here first, and then here, and then Donnell, so right here.
Thank you very much, Professor Hooker, for your presentation. I look forward to reading the book. So James Baldwin has this quote that hope must be invented every single day. And I was curious if in the book you deal with the concept of hope, and so how does hope kind of either bring together Black grief with white grievance in that space?
Yeah, I don't talk about hope very much in the book. I talk about it a little bit, mostly in relation to thinking about the African American thinkers whom I draw in the book, who include, you know, I do write a little bit about Baldwin, but principally Harriet Jacobs, Ida B. Wells, W.B. Du Bois, is to say that they, you know, that when we look at African American political thought, it pushes us to move beyond, you know, this kind of, you know, what I call the false polarity between hope and despair. Because, and what I mean by that is I think they had you know, they could not be nostalgic about some time in the past of the United States where things were better, right? That wasn't the move they could make. And they could also not be, you know, sort of naively hopeful that things were going to get better in the future, because there have been these recurring moments when there's progress and then there's backlash. But what they could do was work towards the world they wanted to see, even if they were not sure it was going to come about, which is, right, what Du Bois called, you know, the hopeful despair, or, you know, despairing hopefulness, right? So for me, I think we can't, you know, and here I think this comes back to, you know, in thinking about US democracy writ large, right? Like, we can't be, this is probably a question for Melvin and not for me, right, about hope and democracy, but that we can't assume that democracy isn't this thing that's simply going to survive. That if we want it to, whether or not we have sources of hope, we have to work to try to make it better. Because there is no alternative, not because we know that it will be, that it is fated to always be expanding in this kind of narrative that we usually tell ourselves.
First, I just want to say thank you to you, Juliet, and also to the panel. This is such an inspiring conversation. I haven't felt this happy listening to academics talk in a long time. And I'm a medievalist, and I'm inspired to go back to my office and start working. So thank you so much to everybody. I have a question that's kind of, I think, picking up on the notion of affect is uncontrollable, and this conversation you were having about some things kept private because they shouldn't be expressed in public, or we don't need to arrange our public life around them. And then maybe picking up a little bit on what Professor Quashie was saying about a broader repertoire for thinking about loss beyond just the ultimate loss. And I wonder, and forgive me because I have not yet read the book, but I will. Is there a prescription in the book for how to broaden an affective repertoire? Because it seems to me that part of the problem with the resort to anger or the inability to experience loss as anything other than grievance is not so much like an absence of feeling, but a narrow affective repertoire. So an inability to experience uncertainty,
Yes.
and an embrace instead of a will to dominate. So how do you broaden kind of whiteness as repertoire for feeling? And how do you broaden the appreciation of the nuances in Black loss beyond just death, but to sort of the ordinary everyday? How do you, so is there a prescription in this for how you create an emotion culture that is a bit more complex? Because I don't think that all emotions are uncontrollable. I think we create emotion cultures, although certain affects might be. So what are your thoughts on that, if anything?
So maybe some of the panelists can help me out if they have thoughts on this. But I mean, I'll start out by saying that I mean, part of what I say in the book is that we need to, and this is because my particular concerns, right? I'm a political scientist, so is that we need to expand the political imagination of both Blacks and whites. Because I argue that they've been restricted by these ways of thinking about loss in different ways, right? So one of the things that I say, without being critical of it, because I understand, we all understand why this happens, right? Is that there's been a dominant account in Black politics that one needs to move from grief to grievance, that you need to move from grief to activism. And I think that there has always been pushback against that, and there's now folks who are saying no to that expectation and that demand, but it has been, I think, quite prevalent. And so part of it is to say, how do we make space for sitting with loss, right? How do we make space for grief that is not grievance in Black politics? And then on the other side, I mean, I also say, that whites also need to learn to sit with loss, and it comes back to this notion of and one of the reasons that I say is because when I first started presenting the white grievance part of the book, people would always respond by saying, well, how can we make it not a loss? Right? So it was like, how can we make it like it's also a win, right? And this is the move. And then I would always be like, well, but why can we not say that it's okay in some instances for white people to lose certain things that are the result of, white supremacy, illegitimate advantage? Why are we so uncomfortable with that? And so part of what I suggest in the book is that 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 it has to do with these ways in which we think about democracy as empowerment and the ways in which white supremacy has made that an expectation. So you don't have to think about the other side of it, which is, that you will lose some often, right? And so those are some of the things that I say. I don't know if it's a full answer to your question.
Do any of the panelists want to get in on this? Go ahead.
Professor Cayley?
Yeah,
Maybe there's a connection between your question and the first question, which is, part of me always wants to just stay in the imaginary totality of a black world, right? So in my opening comments, I was trying to say, I don't want to think about black grief tethered to this binary of white grievance. I want to be able to think about what black grief is and is not and can't be in its own complex failing impossibility. And then if I have to, at the end I was trying to suggest, if the idea of what would it mean for someone who's white in the United States to be able to feel precarity, recognize they feel precarity, account for it as a loss, reckon through that loss as either a failure of democracy, if they think, well, democracy is supposed to offer me that I would never have this precarity, or reckon to it as, oh shit, I'm wrong, it's actually evidence of the success of democracy that I'm feeling this, and to move through that process, that is to see whitely, without needing that seeing having to go through the apparition of blackness. What would it mean for blackness, or black people, or black incident, or black harm, or black narratives to always be the fun house through which the very best of white democratic possibility has to go through? And right, so and I think there's something then about reanimating the language of loss that has to be the project of democracy, and reanimating it as an affective language that has to be the project of democracy, that keeps racialization at the heart of thinking about that language without reinstituting what racialized thought so often gets us into, which is blackness as ideation through which there is this funhouse dynamic, which excludes black people from participating in the ideation of racialized democratic thought. So I think there's something, and I think your book there are these interludes in the book that I think are trying to just leave space for exactly that kind of reanimation. And I do think that if part of it is, let's just say white people, since we're in the binary, if it is about white people seeing whitely, they've got to figure out how to do that without that seeing dependent upon the visage of blackness. Because then we're, right? Because then they need Black Death to be able to maybe get somewhere. And that's unviable for me, right? It might be unviable for more than just me. Yeah. So I love your question. But I think that's part of what I understand your project to be trying to do in political thinking.
Thank you for saying that better than I managed to say it. See, this is why he had
I think we have a question here.
Thank you, Professor Hooker and Professor Quashie, because this is building off your response in the sense that I got the book, so I look forward to reading it. But this is in line with Professor Bush and Professor Kalick has already said, and my brother here about hope. I want to kind of sit with this notion of cauterizing harm, white loss, doing that, right? And wondering if, not trying to model precarity, right? I think that's an approach. I will push back just a little bit, but I do think that's an approach. And I also don't know if it is in the interest of Black studies or Black folks or democratic theorists, so on and so forth, to equip folks with the tools to do that type of, have a reflective practice or a critical interiority. I don't think that's our job or anyone's job, but I do think there is a type of educative practice that should be pushed, and I wonder, I haven't read, so I'm wondering, if there is a way to kind of model that by saying this notion of white loss is not an attack on whiteness, because I think we need to keep the conversation open and not create Gordian stoppers, if you will. But to say that there's a deception, that you've been deceived, right? That there's the lie of white supremacy that we're attacking, not whiteness in itself. So how do we kind of pull those things apart, right? How do we sever white loss from an attack on whiteness and talking about it being a deception more so than it being something in, I'm trying to teach you about yourself, but I'm more so trying to teach you about how the democratic institution in itself have failed you to be able to do that critical thinking that I think that Professor Quashie is getting to.
Yeah, I mean, one of the, I do try to be quite careful in the book about saying that, that we need to think, that whiteness, quote unquote, by whiteness we mean the collection of people who are identified as white, that it's not monolithic, right? That people have a whole set of responses, but also that, that it's also that by that what we mean is a particular set of constructions and ideas that follow from that, and that one of those has been this idea that that one is entitled to exercise political rule, right? To be at the center of political debate. That white priority should govern how we think about about politics. And so part of what I think I would say is that, you're right, that part of the project is to say, when I say that, or when I point to, right, examples of, white citizens who have resisted or being part of, the backlash to racial progress, I think coming back to Thomas's point, that's a choice, right? That's not an inevitability, right? That one can be on a different side, right? And so part of it is, I think, is in, and going back to, to Joel Olson and this whole idea of the ways in which, one of his arguments that I think is quite useful is this idea that, that white supremacy has narrowed white political imaginations, right? So that, freedom becomes having, for example, greater racial standing vis-a-vis others, rather than something more expansive, or the ways in which we think about what kind of economic arrangements we want to have. And so I think that this is precisely it, is thinking, what are the ways in which, what are the things that white people themselves have given up in exchange, if you will, for whiteness, right? For this idea of that racial standing will be enough as opposed to all the other things. Jonathan Metzl has this book called Dying of Whiteness, where, I don't know if you know it, right, where he talks about the ways in which people in various states, I think he looks at 3 states, enact all of these policies and elect people who, refuse to do Medicare expansion, cut public schooling, and what it does is actually harm their own outcomes. And that, I think, is I think what I'm trying to think about, and maybe what you're also getting at with your question.
So listen, we're at time. I just want to take one more, because there was a hand up. I just want to take one more. This will be our final question right here.
Okay, I feel great pressure now. Yeah, good one. Well, thank you all first. This is more, it has to do with what Professor Quashie mentioned. it's more about the formal structure of the book.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about the book also as an aesthetic intervention. Yes. I just wonder, like, if you could tell us more about those interludes, the pauses, and why you choose them and so carefully thought.
That's a wonderful last question.
I know, thank you for that, yes.
Juliet, would you also, I wouldn't want people to think that because we've been talking about whiteness, the book does this beautiful thing of beginning by thinking with whiteness in its necessary totality, and then moving through iterations of thinking about blackness and black encounter and experience. So I just wanted to say that too is part of its structural flourish that's really compelling.
No, thank you. Yeah, so there are 4 chapters. The first is the chapter on white grievance, and then the subsequent chapters, there's a chapter then on the ways in which, black protest, the ability to push back against white grievance has been constrained by these narratives about, what black political mobilization should look like. And then the last 2 chapters are really about saying, how might we try to make sense of this, how might we think about what a more expansive account of black feeling is beyond, let's say, anger at injustice. And so it looks at Harriet Jacobs, the 3rd chapter, it looks at Harriet Jacobs and Ida B. Wells and the ways in which they try to humanize and pay attention to black loss, even as they make claims upon others to attend to it, and what they choose not to expose. And then the 4th chapter is a chapter about black maternal grief and the ways in which black women and black mothers in particular, and people put in the position of mothering have had to engage in this kind of grieving activism. But between each chapter, there are these interludes, and some of them are poems. One of them is an image, a very famous image from some of the Black Lives Matter protests, and the reason for that was because I feel like I had a kind of methodological challenge in this book, because I was writing about loss and I had to turn to affect and aesthetics, which are not things that I felt entirely comfortable, I should say, doing. And so because there were these unrepresentable, unspeakable sort of, dimensions to loss that I felt like, my inclination as a political theorist is we always we look at the poems and we talk about what ideas there are in them. Like, that's what we do. We don't actually know how to talk about anything else, right? And so part of it was just about saying, here are some other ways that you might enter this material, and that these might speak to you and help you see, feel things that I can't do in my prose. But also that there was a way in which they were also, there's a way in which they, the chapters then go back to the ideas. There's a beautiful poem in there that I love, and he's coming. I'm so excited. I just saw the announcement by Ross Gay, and it's called, Eric Garner Planted Flowers, right? And it's about, like, how do we see Eric Garner as a person? And that image that I could never have come up with, because he worked for Parks and Recreation in New York City, of him planting flowers, right? And that comes from the poem.
Well, again, let's thank Juliet and his extraordinary panel. And I really want to encourage you all, if you can't buy the book, to get it from the library. I'm not trying to push units here, but it's an extraordinary read, and it's quite essential in our current moment. So I strongly encourage you to go out and get it, or to find it and read it. All right.